Start the recording. Alright, I hope that's good. Alright. Alright, this workshop is about effective practice. Oh, by the way, I have a cool laser pointer, right? Yeah, but we're just going to be looking at examples of efficient practice and less efficient practice, and also kind of the general idea of how we even get closer to our artistic vision. And then lastly, I'm gonna go through some habits so you could maybe consider applying to your studies. And then just some last words on the whole art community and how it approaches these topics. Yeah, first of all, a disclaimer. I'm not an art teacher. I would consider myself a intermediate artist, and I'm also like self-taught and everything. And everything I'm saying is based off my own experiences in art. I don't know how correct I am about stuff I'm saying. I want you to keep in mind that when you are listening to me through this workshop, is that your art journey is and stays personal, and that some certain methods and even maybe some of the information I'm going to talk about today cannot be applied to everyone. Um, and this whole workshop is just to raise awareness and kind of mindfulness about how we approach our goals or studies. And I'm also going to be bringing up some other art YouTubers and stuff. But this is not in form of personal attacks. I just want to look at their methods and kind of compare them to other methods to see, to kind of like have an example of types of practices in which may be more efficient than others, right? Alright, so this is kind of what I was thinking about when I was coming up with this. So I think we all kind of have an idea of like maybe what we want to draw in the future or who we kind of want to become. I don't think this is true for everybody because I know that people take art less seriously and they're just in it for the doodles and stuff. But generally, a lot of artists, I feel like when they especially look at other art online, they're like, oh, I want to kind of draw in this style maybe, or I want to do these things. It's very like a long-term thought, and it's also abstract, right? And then we also all, have our current art skills and where we are at right now. Now the question is, if you want to get closer to that vision of yours, how would you even do that, right? And I think it's through the form of goals. Compared to the visions, goals are specific, measurable, and attainable. So this is a lot of the things I talk about in the self-study resources with the goal guide and stuff. Um, One very important thing I want to mention is that multiple paths can lead to the same result. So if my vision is I want to become a successful comic book artist, which, if you notice, it's an abstract statement, or I guess subjective, because what does success even mean? I can do multiple things to achieve that. I could decide, am I going to want to go to a publisher and do my stuff that way, or am I going to sit at home and publish myself and, go to other like platforms, or, there's a lot of ways where you could, get closer to that vision. I don't really like to talk about achieving your vision because your vision kind of stays abstract and it's very like subjective. Yeah. The most important thing is for you to find your own practice with these things. Because if you look at this chart right here, from left to right, it's all catered to you. You have your own vision, right? You have your own goals correspondent to your vision and to your position right now. I think that none of us are the same with our skills right now, so it kind of doesn't really make sense to have the same art path for everybody. But also, I guess, depends on the situation. I don't know. Now I'm going to talk about efficient practice, and this is the kind of structure we do in the self-study, where we have these different steps. It's very like structured, right? And it's also very intentional, I would say. So the first thing we do in the self-study journals, if y'all might remember, is that, step one is to first of all come up with a goal, but then also make a plan by just being more specific with your goal and then asking yourself a few questions. What should you practice? What habits would benefit your goal? What kind of obstacles would be in your way? All that stuff. The second step, and the probably most important step, is to actually practice your plan and start drawing, because how are you going to get better at art when you're not really drawing anything? I also want to separate this step into two different categories, which is input and output. So input just being absorbing information, output being just, producing stuff. Um, it's kind of confusing when it comes to art because when we do stuff like art studies, that could be input and output at the same time. Also, like depending on what you're doing, right? But because when you're copying someone else's art or like a reference, you are learning stuff, but also practicing to use your fundamentals, to draw that thing, right? So it's kind of confusing. And then the third step we do in the self study, which we already have done at the beginning of February, is reflecting. And we're kind of reflecting on what we have done, how that kind of has benefited our goal, and what hindered your goal, and then you just kind of move on and try again, and if necessary, you readjust your goal to kind of fit whatever you want to achieve, right? Alright, so this is an example of how this whole process could look like, especially with the practicing your plan with the input and output. So let's say I want to imitate an art style, and just for an example, Sam does art because I think he's pretty like well known. First, specifying the goal, right? So what do I want to draw of him? Because he's an artist. He draws a lot of things. He draws character. I mean, he is character focused, but he also draws environments, and he also has his character designs and all that stuff, right? So just to make it simpler and easier for you, specifying it into what you actually want. So, like drawing portraits, for example. And then this process of the practicing your plan would start. You'd come up with your plan, right? Um, Observing how he draws would be your input. So, this is one way you could do this. I know there's different ways how you could achieve a goal. This is just what I came up with because I think it fits the best into this structure, which is also optional, of course. This is just kind of what works for me and what I also seen work for the majority of people. Um, yeah, but for your input, you would start to absorbing your information, which is, catered to Samda's art. So you would observe how he draws portraits. You would maybe look at his videos, maybe he has some tutorials, look at his drawings. Then, you would try to practice your goal as your output. So you know, you would try to draw portraits like Sam does art, right? You're not really focused on the environments or other stuff, because that's not really your goal. And then as a second input, I put this as a second input because I feel like that makes the most sense, but this is basically just step 3, reflecting and adjusting. You compare your source to what you did. And if you're like, I didn't really understand how he does his colors, or I didn't really understand how he does his, you know, nose or something, then you could go back and reassess to your first input and go through this process over and over again, right? So this is just a more like simple example, but it can get a lot more complex, right? So being able to draw hands, I feel like, which is one of the things artists, especially beginner artists, despise the most. And what I have heard from other YouTubers is that they say, "Oh, just draw 1,000 hands," or "Here's the 1,000 hands in 10 days challenge," where they just draw a bunch of hands the same way, fill up their sketches, and probably even get a burnout. um, yeah, and that's kind of a common thing I see where it's all about the quantity of whatever you're drawing. And it actually is a lot more complex than that. If you change your way of practice and thinking about these things, will increase the quality of your practice and reduce the quantity you have to do, right? So let's look at this, right? So when we talk about drawing hands, first, if you want to specify our goal, what kind of hands are we trying to draw? In what context are we drawing these hands in, right? Because there's a lot of different like variations. Um, so I picked these three. I would say categories or variations of this goal right here. For one, drawing hands from my characters, drawing hands for old characters, and drawing hands from memory. Just to kind of show you how the practice can change depending on what you actually want to draw, right? So for my characters, this is kind of a specification of what we want to achieve later on. I know it's kind of obvious if you like compare these two things, but it will get complex. It will get complex later on. Um, right, so drawing my characters, we want to draw the hands on our characters. For old characters, we obviously want to draw old hands, and from memory, we want to draw from memory, right? Pretty clear. Now, how would the practices look like if we have these separate things which we want to achieve? So, our input, again, the practicing, this is what our practice looks like, would probably be something like looking at hand and arm anatomy, right? For old characters, aged hand and arm anatomy. For memory, we would also look at hand and arm anatomy because that's what we're trying to draw. We're trying to draw hands. One thing you might realize is that I also included the arm anatomy, or at least some parts of the arm, like, I don't know, the wrist, or, just some things, because if you look at our goals, we're drawing the hands on our characters. We're not trying to draw just artworks of just hands, not connected to bodies or something, which I think is kind of the first thing this kind of practice ignores. Because if our goal is to draw the hands on characters, why are we just drawing hands without understanding how they actually connect? And a lot of these artists who do these sort of practices, when they draw their characters with the hands, they will probably start to realize that, oh, why does this look strange? And it's because they haven't figured out how to connect the hands to the arms, to the body yet. Right? So this could be our input. Output, pretty straightforward, practicing our goal, or our desired end result or whatever. And then just the input again to reassess. The input again to kind of compare to what we have learned and comparing that to what we actually did. And I think this is very important if you want to draw from memory or imagination or whatever you want to call it, where it's like, first of all, your output, your practice is going to be drawing from imagination, right? You have your input, you try to draw the same thing from imagination, and then you go back and you change or you look at these things again, based off what you did before and what you got wrong, right? I hope that makes it a bit more clear. I know it's kind of confusing. I hope I've kind of illustrated it in a cohesive way, right? But now we're going to talk about less efficient practice, where things is even probably going to get a bit more complicated. I want to compare two YouTubers and two different methods for the same goal, right? So on the left side we have Kedokat, here we have Use 2D, and they both are talking about how to draw from memory slash imagination. Now you might notice that I put a slash here, and you're like, why? This is two different things. And it actually is, those actually are two separate things in their definitions alone, but it's also confusing because artists also use these words interchangeably, right? So it's kind of confusing, the definition side. I'll just explain it real quick, right? So when we say drawing from memory, that could mean that we are in our head trying to think of an object and drawing that object from the exact same way, from the exact same, everything the same. You're basically just copying what you've seen before. Well, imagination could mean something like that you're creating something new based off what you've seen or whatever, right? But it also gets even more confusing because artists also say drawing from memory, meaning they refer to their memory, but they still mean drawing from imagination because they're referring to the memory, which is now inspiration, and now they create new stuff. So it's really confusing, all these terminologies and stuff. And also, I know some artists just use both words for the same meaning. Um, yeah, so it's really confusing. I put it as a slash, and just to make sure, I went into Kedokat's Discord and I asked him, hey, like, what do you mean by memory and imagination and all that stuff? And like, he does recognize that there's a difference between the definitions, but I think he said something like that in his video, how to draw from memory. He's also talking about how to draw from imagination, right? So just to make that clear. Yeah, but we're going to go into these two separate methods, which I think is going to be very interesting because they both are very different. So let's start with Kedokat, right? His response to why we are facing difficulties when we draw from imagination is because we have no muscle memory developed yet to draw from imagination. He also said that geometric breakdowns don't train your muscle memory. So I think what he means by this is that when you draw a body, chances are that you're probably going to draw a bunch of guidelines, and maybe you're going to draw the rib cage as like a oval sphere shape, or the pelvis is like a cube, and then you're going to do this for the arms, and maybe just some extra guidelines to kind of visualize the form or something, you know. And he said all that stuff you're doing, it does not contribute to your muscle memory, which makes it harder for you to draw from imagination. I think the thing he focuses on a lot, or the most, or I guess what he focuses on in this practice, is only at the very end when he plays down the final line work, and that is kind of what he looks at the most, and that is what he's referring to, you know, for the muscle memory, right? I'm still kind of confused about the term muscle memory and what he exactly means, so I'm not going to get into this too much. Um, yeah. His method of practice is the motion method. I don't know if he came up with this. He does have a PDF about this though, so I don't know. You could take a look at it. But basically, what this method practices is the memory of the object strokes. So basically, trying to memorize all these strokes that later you could, I don't know, draw from imagination somehow. I don't know, right? And he does this by looking at all the shapes, what they're all made of. He focuses also a lot on observation. He has a lot of like exercises and stuff to look at when you're observing things. He's also focusing on drawing without guidelines, which, you know, is pretty clear because, you know, he said that all that sketching and breakdown doesn't train it. But I think he also focuses on no guidelines for stuff like just line confidence, and that, you know, you're drawing faster. Yeah, and he also focuses on repetitive drawing from reference. So, you know, he does a lot of like the same stuff from a reference, right? That probably explained it bad. Basically, he uses a lot of reference and a lot of copies, right? Yeah, used to D. Her response to why we can't draw from imagination is because there's a gap between observational and imaginative drawing, right? And her way of practicing is rotational drawing. So basically, she takes an image of a pose. I know she uses Pose Maniacs as a website of like 3D models, and she pulls up one of the 3D models, but she only looks at the model from one angle. She does not turn it. She does not look at, you know, other angles. Maybe you can do that if you're starting out with this. I'm not quite sure. You should look at her video for that. And what she's trying to train is drawing this image just from this angle and creating different angles from that same image, right? And she's basically training the reading of 3D information from a 2D image, right? She's using a lot of geometric shapes to kind of turn these shapes in space to kind of, you know, get back the, you know, original or like the anatomical details. Yeah, turning the forms, and it's also a lot of mental work. And also took her a long time to master, right? So now I want to look at these two methods in comparison, like we did before with our little graph thingy. I left out the second input because I don't think those videos really went into that. Maybe used to D's video went into that. I'm not quite sure. I don't really remember, right? Yeah, but as we said before, both of these videos claim to kind of practice the same goal, right? Being able to draw from imagination. Kedokat said for anything, I think, in this video, and UCD only focuses on different pose angles. I should also probably clarify that this is her practice, the rotational drawing. It's not essentially the end result. So she uses a reference, draws to different angles, so that later she maybe does not have to look at a reference at all and can draw the poses from different angles, right? Yeah, so her final result is drawing a pose from any angle. Yeah, to further specify what these methods exactly practice and kind of what the end result is supposed to look like, Kedokat trains the memory of the object strokes. UCD is drawing pose angles from imagination, right? Both are the input. They focus, you know, on observing. You know, it's pretty obvious, right? Because you're focusing on input. Kedokat, though, is observing the lines from the reference, while UCD is more focusing on observing the 3D information and, you know, being able to recognize the 3D space those things are in from reference, right? Yeah, and then their output, Kedokat is copying the lines from the reference because, you know, first he observed them, now he's copying the lines. While UCD is already straight up starting to draw based off that imagination and drawing the other angles based off the original reference, right? So what she has observed before. And now I feel like just if you look at this breakdown right here and how all these different methods work, I feel like you can already kind of tell what method is going to be more effective for the goal, being able to draw from imagination, right? Um, just to kind of explain, I guess. Kedokat, if you look at it, he's observing the lines, he's copying the lines. Used to D is already straight up getting into drawing, from imagination and, you know, trying to also get into the mindset of being able to draw from imagination early on. Um, and even her what her method is supposed to do is also, drawing from imagination. While, Kedokat training memory of the object strokes. I'm not quite sure if this works because, I don't really know a lot about muscle memory or if it even exists in, art and stuff. But for me right now, I don't really see a connection between memorizing the lines and then being able to draw from imagination, right? Yeah, so this is my personal opinion. Just kind of summarize the goal effectiveness of Kedokat. I feel like is not as effective because memorizing line work does not contribute to understanding the actual 3D space. And in his practice, he's not really practicing creating new things, but rather just copying stuff. Other than that, though, I think that his method maybe can help beginners start drawing. And it also trains a lot of observation and confidence. Observation because with all his exercises, and confidence for, drawing without guidelines and stuff. Because there is benefits from that, right? But I wouldn't go as far and say that you should never draw with the guidelines if you're trying to draw from imagination, right? But one thing I do want to mention, because this is what he said in his Discord server, is that the objective of remotioning is to solidify that memory first, into which manipulation can occur based off existing memory. So it kind of seems like all of this entire method is, I guess, not there to draw from imagination, even though it's kind of framed as that way. But I guess it's supposed to kind of serve as a foundation for beginners to later draw from memory. I don't know, it's kind of confusing because I think he should have gone into, what the other stuff means and how you can draw from memory from that. I don't know. That's just my personal opinion, You don't have to take it too seriously. But I do think there's a lot of interesting comments under, his video right here you could maybe take a look at. I just think it's an interesting topic in general. Right, used to D, her goal effectiveness, it's very effective, but, it's a great challenge for beginners. I also like that it recognizes the gap between observational and imaginative drawing. And it takes a long time to master. Like, this image was from her video as well, where, she was first trying to draw with this method and, she was struggling, and it's actually, like, such a huge, like, skill curve or whatever it's called, right? But she did it, and she's been practicing for a few years now, and she's, in my opinion, she has mastered it. But I haven't really put as much time into this method. Yeah, it takes a long time to master. It's very difficult. I tried it before. It's tough for me at least, right? Because I guess I'm also not there. But the only way to get there is also to do the work, right? Yeah. So that's it for the effectiveness of the practice. I'm going to now go into some art habits you can maybe use to put into your studies and into your practices and how you maybe approach art and stuff. Right, so dopamine. We've already seen this in the watch party. The video was called How to Get Addicted to Drawing. The link is still in the Discord. Just to summarize, because I thought it was very interesting. The video basically went into the concept of instant gratification and how that can maybe mess up when you try to do stuff like drawing and actually working hard for stuff. Because, for example, when you go on Instagram and you scroll, there's not a lot of work, or there's no work being put into scrolling and getting that instant dopamine, right? Which is why it's also so harmful. And probably, let's be honest, it's all intentional, right? Meta, all these platforms, they all have a bunch of scientists behind those apps to make you addicted and stuff. And this is just one aspect of it, that you don't have to do any work to get that dopamine. That's why they also try to always minimize the amount of buttons you have to press to do certain actions, right? Yeah. And this instant gratification, it can actually make it harder to draw and enjoy the drawing and the effort and the struggles and the tears you put into that, because you're not really used to working for your dopamine as much anymore. Um, yeah, so this is one thing to keep in mind. I think stuff he said I mean, he said a bunch of stuff in the video, but one thing that kind of stuck out the most to me is kind of resisting to the urge to do certain things, which normally give you that instant gratification. For example, when you come home from work, you instantly want to go onto your phone and watch a bunch of TikTok and Instagram. And so, if you want to try to resist the urge, you would actually maybe just wait 5 minutes until you do that stuff. It's very simple, it's very small, and I feel like it's also like effective because I also do have problems with addiction and with Instagram addiction. Anyways, helping. This is my second habit I want to present to you all because I think it's not talked about enough, and I feel like it's also kind of the hardest one to do out of all of them. When you help someone with art, especially someone who is less experienced than you, and you kind of want to tell them these things, you're actually learning yourself as well, right? Because you have to actively break down that information you already know to someone who's less experienced, and you kind of have to really translate it, right, to a different language for them to understand, right? And just doing that alone, you're repeating what you're what you've learned, but also kind of it really does help you see things from other perspectives, or make you get to other conclusions. This is what I did when I was preparing for the first and second color workshop. And for myself, it really just helped organizing and structuring all my information about color. And I feel like after the workshop, I'm a lot better at color than I actually was before, which is, I don't know, kind of ironic because I was trying to teach. Um, yeah, one very important thing though is that when you teach, especially beginners and stuff, you have to be considerate because these are people who are just starting out in art. These are people with their own style, with their own vision, with their own goals, with their own skill set right now. And I mean, we'll also kind of get into that later when I get into like my last words and takeaways and my thoughts about the whole art community and stuff. Um, yeah, but when you try to help people, don't try to change their style or all that stuff, And if you find yourself, oh, I'm not able to help this person without kind of going back and trying to copy their art into my art, then maybe it's better if you don't help that person, or redirect them to someone else, right? Um, yeah. Next one is structuring your time. I heard this one before on YouTube a longer time ago, and I thought it was pretty smart, so I'm just gonna also tell it here. Basically, when you don't have a lot of time on your hands for drawing, one thing you could do is structuring your time in ways where it's pretty like intentional when you draw or what you do, right? So let's say in the morning you have a lot of energy while in the evening you're just kind of tired and you're just kind of, you know, want to get the day done and stuff like that, right? In that case, you could save the hard practices for the morning when you have the most energy, the most mental energy, and for the evening when you just want to chill, you can just do like repetitive practice or kind of mindless practice, or just practicing your penmanship or doing line work for your artworks and stuff. One other thing, it's like when you sit down and draw and first thing you do is try to find references and you spend a lot of time on that. I think another thing was like that you put your that time where you look for references, you do that sometime else, not when you feel like you're ready to draw, maybe sometime before, maybe you're in the bus or whatever. um, so you already have more time when you're drawing and more energy when you're drawing, right? So just kind of being aware of the time you have and the time you're willing to spend on these things, I feel like is very helpful, if you do want to have a very structured approach, right? Because I know some people just love to be spontaneous with things as well. That's totally fine. The last thing is acceptance. I wanted to bring this in because I had some conversations with some artists, not too long ago, I think, about acceptance and kind of accepting your own mistakes and your, because let's be honest, art is an incredibly different hobby and an even harder profession, right? Because we are actively testing ourselves and testing our knowledge, and we're also actively comparing ourselves, comparing to other artists and also to ourselves and our past mistakes and stuff. And I want you all to kind of, yeah, mistakes are mistakes, but mistakes are inaccuracies with your art. They do not mean that, oh, you messed up your entire, you know, um, art, whatever. You just messed up that part of the drawing. And I think it's very important to practice patience. Even if it gets harder because of dopamine and doom scrolling and all that stuff, right? Um, yeah, and I would just kind of suggest that if you do struggle with stuff like that, with acceptance, to kind of get into a mindset where you build a good relationship with drawing and with your art and stuff. Um, so you could move on faster from your mistakes and try again and try to do better. Yeah. Yeah, now we already have gotten to my last words. I don't know how much time has passed. But I do have quite a few things to say. The first thing I want to say that just because someone said it does not mean it's true. And I want to talk about art YouTube because that's, I think, where it's the most prevalent. Also, of course, when I talk to other people online, but they got their information from art YouTube. So I feel like there's kind of a dilemma going on with art YouTube because there is so much information on YouTube, which is also a good thing because that means we have access to a lot of things, right? Um, but due to the format of YouTube and due to the algorithm, we only see a fraction of what is really out there. And the things we typically see are the most controversial or the most simplistic or the most entertaining videos, right? Because, let's be honest, would you rather listen to a 2 hour art lecture with crappy audio, with no visuals, by some professor who you cannot connect to, or just watch a 10-minute video, super simple information from, some art YouTuber with cool effects and stuff? Um, yeah, and that way some of the information just kind of gets filtered out. Um, and another thing I see from this dilemma is the refeeding, or I guess a part of the dilemma is the refeeding of information, which can be a problem sometimes, because with all these YouTube videos, there's always certain methods floating around and kind of are the most used. And with time, they're just getting more and more simplified because people kind of forgot where these methods actually came from and what their purpose was, right? And then with all these people, they get their information from other art YouTubers, and then they kind of spread that to other people, and with that time, it's like playing Gartic Phone, and it just gets more and more kind of diluted, right? One example I have is the racist triangle from Colleen. It was a big controversy a few years ago where this art YouTuber named Colleen was fixing her viewers' art. And because a known method to drawing side profiles is to actually draw a line from the nose to the bottom of the chin, which kind of is supposed to give you the mouth area and stuff like that. And this has been a method which has been pretty, like, I'd say, I'm not quite sure, but I think it's like used in maybe the animation industry and stuff like that. Um, yeah, but the issue, the issue with this is that it's not really for all ethnic, for all groups, and in certain cases can get rid of ethnic features of people of color or whatever, as you see right here in this video. This is a TikTok where this was just like kind of showing what happened in her original video. I don't know if it got taken down or something. I think it did. Would make sense because she also said some pretty racist stuff. Um, yeah, and like this whole, this is not true. This line right here, because when they did that, when whoever came up with this method came up with this method, it was only for white people, I think, right? Along those lines, and maybe other groups with similar features to white people, right? But it's like, as far as the nose goes, right, or the mouth area, right? So it's like as you can see, information gets refed so many times. It's so simplistic now, right? No one really knows where it came from, what the original purpose of it was. And now, all of a sudden, we have situations like this where it just doesn't work, right? And even though I guess she was trying to help, I don't know, what her true intention was, or if she was even really thinking that way. Um, what she said is just not true, right? Yeah, so that's something I want y'all to keep in mind. Just because someone said it doesn't mean it's true. Even everything I'm saying right here in this workshop, um, whatever, right? Um, the next thing I want to kind of touch upon is that people have different personal approaches. I did kind of touch upon this when I was talking about the organizing time and stuff like that, because some people are more spontaneous and that's the environment they work in better. But another example is that some people are more analytical and some people are more intuitional when it comes to art. This is a video from the watch parties we were going to watch, which we're probably not going to watch anymore because, as you've noticed, I'm pretty inconsistent with these, have been, because I'm pretty busy. And also, this is a very long video, and I was kind of debating if it's going to be too much, because this is kind of like the workshop time. I didn't really want watch parties to be this long, but I do think it's a pretty interesting video, because it kind of breaks down the different types of people there are, and also how you can become more intuitional as an analytical person, right? But I just wanted to put this there, because I was talking to Devin in the server. Shout out Devin, by the way. um, and they're like saying that they're actually more, I think, intuitional when it comes to, or like experimental when it comes to color, where they don't really look at all this analytical stuff, but that's actually how they thrive, just by doing, and figuring out themselves, mainly through what they feel looks right and everything. I think that's what he said, or she. I'm sorry. Um, right. The last thing I want to say, probably the most important thing, is that art and the human body is incredibly complex, and I think we kind of forget about this because we see all these different methods online. Um, the truth is that there's different methods because they're applied in different situations, and also people came up with them at different times. One example for that is the line of action. Um, I do know that they also use the line of action in animation and all that stuff, but I don't really want to get into that part of the line of, how the line of action is used. I want to more get into um, the normal um, drawings of figure drawing, where it's like you draw longer poses and stuff. You don't really focus on quick sketches, literally just like 10-minute poses and 20. When you have the time actually to figure stuff out. That's kind of the area where what I want to talk about, because I know that as a beginner artist, people always tell you to use the line of action to draw and all that stuff. And yeah, for a beginner, maybe that makes a lot of sense, but and is also maybe easier to understand. But it kind of gets rid of the complexity of what is behind the line of action. So basically, as far as I know, I think the line of action has been around, like that method has been around for like ever since photography was invented or before. Because when you draw people, or especially people moving, if you have ever tried that, it's extremely difficult. And one thing artists would do, as far as I know, is put down that line of action fast, right? Because it's like the fastest, it's just like one line, boom, and then you kind of fill in that other information afterwards. And this is kind of like a way where you could just draw people in a quick way and you would still have all that movement going on, right? That's why I say, I know it also gets used in animation and stuff where that also makes sense. But for when you change your, basically, if you now go, okay, I want to more get into drawing figures and what actually is behind all that stuff and what is actually the body made out of, why are we moving this way, the line of action is not going to cut it anymore, because overall it's a simplification of all the stuff which are going on in the body. And my second image here is from Michael DiMattesi, because he focuses a lot on force. That's what he calls it, right? But kind of the force of gravity and how these different things affect the body and how we actually um, try to balance our body so that we don't tip over and stuff. And that's why, we do some stuff like putting down our arm or lifting, this up, or, like basically kind of asking why are we even moving like this, right? And the line of action, I feel like it's just a very simplified form of depicting movement stuff, right? But I still want to tell y'all that it gets more complex than that. But even more complex than this is real life. Um, because all these methods people are coming up with and have been coming up with, they're just coming up with these methods to try to understand what is going on and to also help them draw these subjects from real life. I hope that wasn't too much information, but to kind of, I guess, make it more clear. Even though methods help us understanding these real phenomenons which are happening, the reality will still exist beyond the method, right? And which also means in return that all these methods, they're all focused on different things from that real life, because I don't think you can really summarize the reality and the nature and the physics and all of that stuff into a simplistic method like this, right? And all these methods are basically just focused on different situations of how you want to draw these things, right? Okay, I hope that wasn't so I hope that wasn't too confusing. um yeah, we made that shit up. My last and final point with that, we made all this method up, right? um which means that people are not necessarily 100% correct every time with stuff regarding to art and to methods, and which is also why nobody should come to you and be like, oh, you have to use this method, you have to use this. That's not true, because things also work differently for you. It's also what we talked about. Yeah, and you have your very own path. You want to have somewhere to go, which is maybe different from that person who's giving you all that advice, right? Yeah, that is my workshop. That's kind of my message. Lastly, develop critical thinking, just like I've done right here in this workshop. With time, I think it's very interesting, very good and interesting if you're able to compare methods like that. So you're kind of aware, like, okay, what are they trying to tell me? What is this actually supposed to do? Like, is it actually trying to, fulfill the thing I want to do, or is it just like framed in that way and actually it's kind of targeted towards something else. um yeah, but kind of stay mindful of these things, and this is your art journey, and you're the one who probably knows the most about where you want to go. That does still mean, though, that people are more experienced than you, and if they give you advice, I would recommend you to try to consider their advice, but that doesn't mean that that's your entire reality now and that you have to do everything that way. Just pick out what you think is good for your art journey, but still maybe try those things they're telling you, yeah, but you don't have to blindly refeed all the information, just like the racist triangle, like, oh, you have to draw this way, and then like, oh, okay, I'm gonna draw this way for my whole life now, for my whole side profiles, and then you tell that to someone else who's drawing, black characters, and turns out you are in a whole internet controversy because you said some very racist stuff, right? And I don't think you want that to happen. Yeah, that's it. That's it for the workshop. That's all kind of what I wanted to say. Um, oh, Devin, you're here. Yeah, any pronoun is fine. All right, that's good to know. Yeah, that was the workshop. Wow, some people showed up. If you have any questions regarding what I think or what I said, you can put those in the chat right now. So I could take a look and answer them right now. But you can also reach out to me anytime in the channels. Um, yeah, let me read some things the chat has said. So Handholder said, "I'd say memory is for normal things. Imagination is using what you know to draw something very different, like a monster made of hands." Yeah, exactly. Um, I think they were trying to train different things. Muscle memory. Yeah, Yeah, I agree as well. I just kind of because when you look at the video and stuff, it's very like all that stuff he was saying, he kind of more said in his Discord and his PDF and all that stuff. While the video was very like, oh, this is how you draw anything from imagination, and I only looked at the video. That was the first thing I looked at, and then I was like, okay, well, that doesn't really make much sense. Let me try to see what he actually thinks, so I don't say a bunch of stuff right here, right now, which is maybe not as true, right? Um, that advice for being considerate really resonated with me because I remember throwing away a drawing I made that I sat quite some time on because the person I showed it to only criticized it. Yeah, I know it's pretty rough. I know someone else also in the server was saying that they're really glad that we don't criticize art in the gallery channels and stuff like that. Um, because the gallery is used for looking at art. You wouldn't go to an art museum and go up to the artist and be like, "Oh, you drew that. You drew that wrong, right?" Um, yeah. Um, um, Mimichi says no art is bad. I think subjectively, art can be bad because we're always kind of our brain is wired to look at aesthetically pleasing stuff and kind of focus on what looks so good, what doesn't look good, and these different like art kind of methods or rules, they're kind of set up in a way how to make your art aesthetically pleasing. But if you're here's the thing though, if you are making an artwork and your goal or your intention with the artwork is I want to make it not aesthetically pleasing and intentionally want to make it look like this so the viewer feels this and this, that art, I wouldn't say it's bad because it exactly fulfilled that what it was trying to do. So I think that in that way art could be bad if it kind of goes against what you were trying to do in the first place. I don't know if that makes like much sense, right? um yeah, but just to kind of share my own thoughts about that stuff. um and I think that's also where a lot of these abstract artists and came in, where it's like, oh, but it's about the meaning, and I changed my meaning throughout the process, and actually want to, you know this, or oh, it doesn't mean anything, and it kind of also takes away the abilities to say, oh, that's bad. I don't know, it's all like very confusing, also very subjective, I think. But just based off reality and physics, there is things which can be more unrealistic. I don't know, it's very like weird, the whole dynamic, because we're also all, this is why I say like art is so complex, and the human and nature and physics, because it really is a conversation with what is real, right? With what is outside of your window right now, and how you interpret those things, because this is where the concept of balance and contrast comes in, based off, or I guess, evolutionary changes and stuff. We see things differently, or we look at certain things, the how do I say? You look at, like the focal point or stuff like that, or we're very like contrast oriented because, people say, oh, we used it to survive and stuff like that. Um, so it's like, it's very complex actually, because it's really like, how do you pick things up? How do humans pick stuff up? Which kind of, I think, determines those rules, like the um, for example, rule of thirds, or the Fibonacci spiral, just like what looks aesthetically pleasing, because, we are also just kind of always comparing things with each other. I don't know, it's very complex. I'm just talking now. Yeah. Um, yeah, one other thing I wanted to comment on Handhelder. Um, when he said that imagination is using what you know to draw something very different, like a monster made of hands. I had this conversation with someone where they're, I mean, you probably all have heard it, where they're like, oh, AI, it's just like how people draw, because it's like, you all use inspiration for something, and then, all that data is just inspiration for artists, which is like, I for a long time I did think about that argument, because I'm like, how is there even any is there even any like counter argument to that? But then I like realized, like, sci-fi is probably the perfect example, like the genre, because before the genre was kind of like invented, or stories where it came up were made up in that genre. There was nothing really before that which was like sci-fi, because some person made that up. And the way sci-fi works, I think, is looking at the future and comparing it to right now. What would the future look like, maybe, and how do I construct a world around these things, these events which happened. And that's when we get a bunch of like spaceships with the organic shapes and all that stuff, right? And if you really look at other stuff, there's no real inspiration, you know, like the people who made that shit up, they didn't really look like, oh, I'm gonna copy it from this because they already had organic spaceships, maybe, but like the core thought is like, what happens right now? What will the future look like? And then they make up an entire universe based off that thought. And AI cannot do that because AI will always look at other people and their ideas. But at some point, those ideas, were made up by someone. So it's kind of like, I don't know. It's very interesting. Like, I like thinking about these things. Um, yeah, but it's very interesting. And AI sucks, right? That's the moral of the story. And that's also the end of the workshop, I guess.